50 years ago, a small town in Missouri hosted an unlikely event. A huge, wild rock and roll festival.
All right! All right! Everybody say yeah! Say hell yeah! Say hell yeah!
This took place right in the heart of Sedalia, Missouri. A lot of the long-haired hippies who were there pretty much remember it this way.
A couple 100,000 people just having a blast.
It was the best weekend ever.
But those privy to the quiet small-town life remember things very differently.
It was the worst thing I've ever seen in Sedalia, Missouri in my life, and I'm 90 years old.
To put the timing of all this into context, it was the summer of 1974.
The bloody experience of Vietnam
Not another dime for this war.
is to end in a stalemate.
Leave this area immediately.
Because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
And the United States was not so united. The war in Vietnam was over while the war on drugs was heating up. Congress was getting ready to impeach President Nixon for his involvement in the Watergate scandal. And over one scorching hot weekend in Sedalia, Missouri, the cultural divide was on full display.
There's another set of boobs. All right, we're looking good.
There were a lot of naked people at Sedalia.
We didn't really care. We had bigger issues. We had the Vietnam War. We had Nixon.
Maybe you've heard of Woodstock, that iconic music festival in the summer of '69 that defined the hippie counterculture. But in that summer of 1974, Missouri had its own type of party, the Ozark Music Festival. And the legal aftermath created a ripple effect that people are still feeling today.
This was our Woodstock.
This made Woodstock look like child's play.
That was the last of the really big, silly, stupid outdoor shows. Nobody was going to let this happen again.
This is A People's History of Kansas City. I'm Suzanne Hogan. Depending on which side of the chain link fence you're on that weekend, the Ozark Music Festival was either 3 days of heaven or 3 days of hell. But both sides will tell you this. It was unforgettable, it was crazy, and it was real. This is the story of what happened and why, 50 years later, some people are still arguing about whether it should have happened in the first place. To help us navigate it all is Jefferson Lujin, who is making a documentary all about that wild weekend. We just heard some clips from it, and we'll hear many more this episode. For over a decade, Jefferson's become an expert on this festival, really. He's interviewed over 100 people about it, gathered bootlegs, photos, and all types of archival materials for it.
Originally, the goal was to have it done for the 35th anniversary, so we kind of missed the mark a little.
Jefferson missed the mark back in 1974, too. He's from Sedalia, but born a generation too late. Unfortunately, he wasn't at the festival when it happened.
I was 3. I have other friends that remember distinctly, driving around town and their mothers covering their eyes so they don't see, fill in the blank, usually nudity or whatever untoward acts were going on downtown. But I don't remember any of that.
Still, he could never escape the legend around that weekend.
Teachers would reference this giant concert. They went crazy and went to a New York bar. And the bouncer or whatever checking the license saw I was from Sedalia and just freaked out. It's like, that was the greatest party I've ever been to. And like, really? In my stupid town?
It's these kinds of stories that drove Jefferson over all these years to interview so many people. His goal was to figure out, how the hell did this happen? As it turns out, one of the driving forces was a guy Jefferson talked to by the name of Chris Fritz, who set up this whole festival.
Apparently he's the same as he is now, just a very lovable, just loved the music.
So this is Chris Fritz.
For an admission price, you get to see a great concert all day.
He was in his 20s when he first got the idea to book a big outdoor festival in Sedalia. But the idea actually was born in Kansas City, at Fairyland Amusement Park of all places. Before it closed in the late 70s, Fairyland was owned by the Brancato family, and Chris Fritz worked with them and another guy named Bob Shaw, who was in advertising. Together, they'd put on big rock shows at the park.
You get to go on all the rides free all day, and it's just kind of like a little mini festival.
The shows were a hit. They all made money. And Chris Fritz, who was this young guy in his 20s, won the trust of these older businessmen in their 50s.
And that's when he hit him up with the bigger idea.
The bigger idea was Sedalia. To understand why Chris Fritz and his partners would later face criminal charges for all this, you have to first understand Sedalia.
Yes, this is Sedalia's story.
This is a movie the town made about themselves back in the 1960s. Jefferson dug it up for his documentary.
Sedalia liked to think of itself as, being permanently in the 50s.
And if there's a better community in the United States to work, live, enjoy life, and raise a family, Sedalia people simply haven't seen it.
At around 13 square miles with a population of about 20,000 today and back in 1974, Sedalia is a conservative place in a conservative state. They voted for Nixon in the last presidential race by a margin of 2-1. And, crucially,
Sedalia is home for the Missouri State Fair.
The fairgrounds. That's what was so appealing to Chris Fritz. But obviously not to host typical fair activities. He wanted to put on a rock festival. But he knew it was going to be a hard sell.
We were thinking, well, really an extreme rock show probably won't be what is on everybody's appetite, especially in the Bible Belt and Sedalia.
Now, what everyone in Sedalia will tell you is they said it was going to be a bluegrass festival and they snuck in rock bands. And that's not quite the case.
So the original plan, Fritz told Jefferson, was to cater to the region, bring in bluegrass with some rock and roll acts.
That's where we came up with the name, Ozark Music Festival. We were looking at like Nitty Gritty Dirt Band and Earl Scruggs.
And there was bluegrass music.
This was where one of Chris Fritz's partners really came to shine. Bob Shaw, a master advertiser. He was good at pitching a youth festival concept in a way that was appealing to state officials.
He was a great salesman. Shaw was the one that most everyone knew.
So while Chris Fritz was figuring out which musical acts to book, Bob Shaw and other partners on their team hammered out the contract. And we should linger just a moment on that contract. It's significant. Because while they were going back and forth, agreeing on the money and defining terms like adequate security, the promoter's lawyers made sure the contract also contained one key provision.
They snuck in a bit that said, this cannot be canceled until the day of the festival, which of course, by then everyone's there.
This contract became a big issue for the Missouri Senate subcommittee during their investigation after the festival. But on April 11th, 1974, the contract was signed and it was official. The Ozark Music Festival would be happening on the Missouri State Fairgrounds just a few months later that July, which meant Chris Fritz didn't have a lot of time.
You kind of like woke up and go, wow, this is really happening. We put this together like a few months, which is today would be unheard of.
And as the act started to get booked, the vibe started to shift.
It just started organically growing into kind of a different event.
Harder rock acts like Leonard Skinner, the Eagles, Ted Nugent, even a few up-and-comers like Aerosmith were joining the bill. And together with Bob Shaw, the ad guy, they started selling this broader, more hard rock lineup nationwide. First, putting an ad in Rolling Stone magazine.
And of course, everyone read Rolling Stone that was interested in this sort of stuff back then. So it was the show to go to.
And it was being advertised all over FM radio.
Hey, baby, welcome on in here to the Wolfman Jack Show.
So there's another character that's kind of important in all this. Radio DJ Wolfman Jack.
Right.
Who is this guy and what kind of sway did he have?
Been in radio for years, a very important DJ. He had just been in American Graffiti the year before.
The Wolfman is everywhere.
And he had a show called Midnight Special.
A late-night program broadcast right here on NBC.
It was very popular. That's why they invited him, and they thought that, the kids would love him.
And they did. So they got him on board.
Now we're going to be on the grass at the Missouri State Fairgrounds. State Fairgrounds in Sedalia.
Wolfman wasn't just reading ads. They also booked him to MC the festival that weekend.
Missouri. I'll be there, but dig who else going to be there. The Eagles, America, Bachman Turner Overdrive, Marshall Tucker Band.
In the weeks leading up to the festival, the people of Sedalia were getting nervous.
It was not prepared.
Tamara Pendel Crouch was 20 when the festival came to town.
There were people that actually packed up their kids and left Sedalia for the weekend. The town people freaked out.
A lot of people in Sedalia wanted this thing stopped. In a letter to the local newspaper, the Daily Democrat, one reader, counting himself among the, quote, God-fearing people of Sedalia, said he was sure the whole thing would be a wild, sinful masquerade. And it's hard to blame them. Rock and roll kind of had a bad reputation. Woodstock happened 5 years earlier in the summer of '69, and though it's often remembered fondly, it also had a dark side. Some people died. There were assaults, hundreds of overdoses. Festivals could be dangerous, and people knew it. Also, just a year before the Ozark Music Festival, there was a smaller festival in rural Missouri that was shut down midway through after reports of numerous drug overdoses and an assault on a 15-year-old girl.
You know, all they thought was, okay, here comes sex, drugs, and rock and roll. They were just scared.
And not just in Sedalia. On July 8th, just 11 days before the Ozark Festival was set to begin, the governor of Missouri, Kit Bond, met with law enforcement officials. Part of the reason for the meeting was undercover agents observing flagrant drug use and bad security at a festival on Chuck Berry's farm outside of St. Louis. Supposedly, the Chuck Berry attendees were heading west to Sedalia.
And those people all pretty much walked down I-70, you know. The Highway Patrol called Sedalia, apparently said, they're coming your way.
Officials were worried about even more drugs in Sedalia. Hence the question posed in that meeting in the governor's office, can we cancel this thing? But after taking a second look at the contract and its cancellation clause, they came to the conclusion that legally they couldn't. The train was out of the station, the festival couldn't be stopped. In days, thousands of hippies would descend on Sedalia, Missouri. Would it be a weekend of peace, love, and rock and roll? Or would the town's fears come true? The first red flag was a drug bust gone sideways. The festival was set to begin on July 19th, a Friday. But it actually kind of started earlier. Ticket holders started setting up camp all that week, and undercover agents with the Missouri Highway Patrol went to the campgrounds to first confirm that illegal drugs were being bought and consumed, and then to make arrests.
And it did not happen.
According to Jim Mays, a highway patrolman Jefferson interviewed for his documentary, things didn't go as planned.
As we drove in there, we got out of the car and we started these people, and there was probably, I want to guess, 200 to 300 of them over in this campgrounds, and they started after us.
The crowd started throwing things at the officers, stones, pieces of pavement, pretty much whatever they could get their hands on.
Jars of canned fruit and vegetables. They were just beaten by car to pieces.
The officers ended the night with 17 arrests, 4 beat-up cars, and a question. This was just a few hundred people. Can we keep doing this when there's tens of thousands? Their conclusion? They decided to leave security up to the promoters and stay off the grounds.
They, had their meeting and said, we're not going in there. We're going to contain it, but we're not going in there because, any uniform would have set off who knows what.
Jefferson says this was a crucial decision. Basically, any kind of security within the festival gates would be handled not by the state, not by local law enforcement, but by the promoters.
Security for the stage was pristine, but the rest of the fairgrounds was open season.
Here's what stage manager Joe Maceda told Jefferson about it all.
So they hired Wells Fargo. And basically they showed up with about 1,000 T-shirts that said security on them. And they took 1,000 kids out of the audience. Okay, you all work for us. Here's how much we're paying you. Here's your T-shirt. Get to work. And that was it.
And we should note there was some logic to Wells Fargo's peer security methods. But promoter Chris Fritz said it just didn't work in this case.
No training, no clear direction, lame supervisors. That was the downfall.
By Wednesday, the crowd at the campground had grown to 3,500. By Friday morning, traffic was backed up for miles. Jefferson talked to local politician Jim Mathewson, who set up a complaint hotline for residents. He remembers another one of the big issues was that lots of the festival goers forgot to bring enough food, much to the detriment of some local farmers.
Several pigs were killed, a lot of field corn.
All of a sudden, this boy started screaming as he was coming through the door, "Fairfax, now they've killed one of my cows!" You know, and they butchered it, and they were starting to barbecue it.
For the hungry hippies, it seemed like nothing was off limits. As crowds swelled, reportedly organizers were too slow in opening the gates. And at some point, someone cut a hole in the fence surrounding the fairgrounds, and people just flooded in. Because the guards were not allowed to intervene with force, they stopped taking tickets. So we don't know exactly how many people were there.
I would guess 250,000. They always say like 180. Some people say 350. You don't know.
By Friday morning, the Ozark Music Festival was essentially a free concert.
Hey, producer David McKeel here. If you're liking this story about a crazy time in Missouri that went down 50 years ago, then you might like another People's History of Kansas City episode we did. It's called Making the Lake of the Ozarks. It's all about the creation of this man-made mega tourist destination. But to build it involved corruption, displacing families, and landed some of the developers in jail. That's Making the Lake of the Ozarks. Cue it up in your feed right now.
Earlier, we met Tamra Pendell-Crouch.
The town people freaked out.
Tamra was 20 years old when the festival came to her hometown. She was the perfect age to go, of course, so she did.
I grew up a lot that weekend, I gotta say. It was an experience.
She talked to our producer, David McKeel.
So your parents just let you go?
I've got to be honest here. I didn't tell them I was going either way.
One of my biggest takeaways from talking to a dozen or so people who went to the festival was how young they were.
I was 19 and my buddy was 20.
I was 19 and she was 18.
19. 16. Too young to be doing that.
I had just turned 15 years old, man.
What else do you remember about that time?
Nixon had just spoke at graduation. We'd actually protested, and that's when someone said, "Hey, have you heard about Sedalia, Missouri?"
When I saw the list of bands, which was so phenomenal.
The lineup was just unheard of. Even though the concert's in Sedalia, Missouri, this must be legit. It's in Rolling Stone magazine.
I don't even know where Sedalia is.
Okay, peace, love, death. Let's go hitchhike there. What's the worst that can happen?
So we're tripping on mescaline, we're looking at the stars, and we're on our way to Sedalia. We had no idea what we were about to witness or be part of.
And what about when you got there?
Turns out we didn't need tickets anyway.
All of a sudden, a girl said, "Hey, you want in?" And the fence was loose, and she just pulled the fence down.
They're just people letting you in, and they have shirts on that say security. They said, just go ahead.
We just walked right in, and man, let the crazy stuff begin.
It was wall-to-wall people.
I had never seen that many people.
It reminded me of Woodstock.
The crowd almost went out of sight.
I mean, it was a sea of people.
As far as the eye could see.
And there's one crucial detail about that weekend that everybody talks about.
What's that?
The heat.
It was hot.
What do you remember about how hot it was?
The humidity was phenomenal.
There's no wind. There's no breeze. There was no shade.
It was over 100 degrees all 3 days, and people dealt with it in all kinds of ways.
You know, nudity everywhere.
Slowly, the clothes started coming off of people. They were walking around half naked or naked.
Men, women, it didn't matter.
It was just a bunch of hippies having fun, man, and just doing what they had to do.
And there's the stage. Holy cow. Look at that. And now I'm ready to hear some music.
I know it's useless. Hanging out with you, but I'm a sophomore.
That Friday, the Ozark Music Festival officially started. The opening act, Fresh Start, then later Bob Seger, Elvin Bishop, David Bromberg, the Eagles. That night, while news broke that Nixon was expected to be impeached, the Eagles even had a special dedication for the president.
This goes out to Richard Nixon. This is called I'm Already Gone.
Already Gone was an anthem for that weekend in more ways than one. For the conservative grown-ups in Sedalia, Already Gone might describe this whole generation. Like, who were these lost souls who come stumbling into their town?
Army of hippies, man.
Clearing out their stores.
I remember my shock at going in the store and seeing all the shelves already totally barren.
And in some cases, even sleeping in their yards.
The people who could not camp in the fairgrounds ended up camping on their lawns.
And then there was the issue of drugs.
The only negativity was the heat and the humidity and lack of water and some people taking too many drugs, you know.
There's no sugarcoating it. There were a lot of drugs that weekend. In an atmosphere of loose security, people were not being shy.
Every kind of drugs that was on the market in the 70s.
You name it, and it was all over the place if you wanted it, obviously.
And they were going around like concession people. I've never seen that before. I've never seen it since.
Filmmaker Jefferson Lujin says at the Ozark Music Festival, just like Woodstock, there were hundreds of overdoses. Dozens of people were taken to Sedalia's hospital that first Friday night. Hundreds more over the course of the whole weekend. Most of the cases were due to some combination of drugs, alcohol, and the oppressive heat.
The drug use was insane. Some of these bootleg tapes I've got, you hear people in the background screaming, I need speed, I need, this, that.
Speed! Who's got speed?
To call it a drug festival really is accurate.
As the crowds and the heat continued to swell on Saturday, so did the rumors of multiple deaths.
You know what I'm talking about? They OD'd.
Prompting this stage announcement from performer Jimmy Spheris.
Why don't you try getting high on the person sitting next to you? Lasts a lot longer.
There was one death. On Saturday morning, a 20-year-old from Illinois, Alan Crognati, collapsed and was later declared dead from an overdose.
I should add also, a lot of Sedalians sort of stepped up, knew these were just kids, and made food for them, put their hoses out, let them, most Sedalians did that, I would say. It's the ones that tell the most graphic stories that get repeated, so.
I love that you bring that up because I was thinking about that. It's like the bad news is kind of what people cling on to, but there was probably a lot of really nice news that happened that weekend.
Right. For the most part, it worked out pretty well.
If there's one group of unsung heroes from those few days, it would be the doctors and other medical personnel on call that weekend. So in addition to names like Ted Nugent and Joe Walsh, let's give a shout out to Dr. Albert J. Campbell and his staff, who worked 18 to 20-hour days, treating around 2,500 patients. Dr. Campbell later testified that about 300 of them would have perhaps died if they hadn't had emergency care. Meanwhile, most festival goers that Saturday were watching Electric Flag, Lynyrd Skynyrd, Aerosmith, and the eclectic mix that day was rounded out by a Kansas City soul group called Bloodstone. If you're looking for reasons to call the Ozark Music Festival a success, you'd find them. Thousands and thousands of people showed up, braved the heat, and had a great time.
A great lineup. That music all made sense together in a lot of ways.
If you were looking for reasons to call it a disaster, you'd find plenty of those as well. There were assaults, prostitution. In Sedalia proper, there were reports of home break-ins. And like I mentioned earlier, Sedalia had set up a hotline service to receive complaints about it all.
And the lines, were just lit up for a week.
For the most part, Sunday was the great exodus. As the festival wrapped up, many of the promised country rock and bluegrass acts got their time on the stage. Earl Scruggs, Marshall Tucker Band, the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band. In America, the final act that night played to a crowd of only around 15,000. When they finished, that was it. Sure, some people kept camping out and partying for a while, but most festival goers were making their way back home. while the people of Sedalia were gradually coming out of their makeshift weekend bunkers to deal with the mess left behind. The literal mess.
Human waste everywhere. So that was a mess. The fairgrounds, that was the real kicker to the town, that when they saw what happened to the beloved fairgrounds, because the fair is a couple weeks away, and it did look awful.
The human waste included garbage and fecal matter. And then, of course, there was the political mess. On Monday, a group of state senators toured the fairgrounds and held a press conference to announce their plans to form a state Senate subcommittee to investigate the horrors and make sure something like this never happened again. Within a month, state officials would testify about being deceived by the promoters, saying they were assured there'd be adequate security and the bill would only feature light rock music. They dissected Wolfman Jack's radio ads, pointing out coded messages.
Now we're gonna be on the grass at the Missouri State Fairgrounds. I've invited be on the grass at the Missouri State on the grass.
Yeah, we're gonna be on the grass. Of course, grass being marijuana.
And the other phrase senators highlighted:
no hassles guaranteed.
And no hassles guaranteed.
They took to mean all kinds of things, like we're not going to have any laws here and you can do all the drugs you want kind of thing. And this was a paranoid time, you know. They probably were playing his commercials backwards to listen for secret messages.
Bob Shaw, one of the older advertising guys who helped put the festival on, took a lot of the heat for this. The whole festival and the aftermath from it was very stressful for him. During that weekend, Jefferson says he actually had a heart attack, a dramatic event that remains controversial to this day.
This led to the rumor that he fakes the heart attack so they can sneak all the money out in an ambulance. Or hearse, depending on who's telling the story, in his coffin, right? There's no truth to it. Why they would have to sneak it out, it doesn't make much sense anyway, but this is another part of the lore.
Jefferson says there's no evidence that Bob Shaw's heart attack was fake. He did have heart problems.
He eventually dies of a heart attack. And you can see the stress of this thing. I mean, one of his daughter actually talks about this moment where Shaw and Brancato, the two businessmen that put all the money up, are standing on the steps of the administration building watching this freak show unfold.
And he had his hand on his head, and I'll never forget it. He goes, "God damn it, Bob."
Bob Shaw later had to testify before the Senate committee and explain the genres of performers in minute detail. One notable exchange, the senator asked, "Did you in fact have any bluegrass performers?" Shaw said, "Well, Earl Scruggs I think would be considered bluegrass." The senator responds, "No, not by a real connoisseur he wouldn't." Ultimately, the committee concluded that the contract should have never been signed in the first place. But because it was signed, the state should have taken it to court in order to get it canceled. Meanwhile, a grand jury issued warrants to promoters Bob Shaw, Chris Fritz, and Sal Brancato of the Brancato family who ran Fairyland Park, and their lawyer. But in the end, none were convicted. A year later, because of all this, Governor Kit Bond signed a bill giving county and municipal judges the authority to regulate big festivals, so they could call them off if they deem warranted. While the Missouri State Fairgrounds would go on to host other rock events, they would never again host a festival as big as the Ozark Music Festival of 1974. And after that summer, the culture clash wasn't just happening in courthouses and Senate hearing rooms. It was also happening at kitchen tables across the country, as parents reckoned with their kids. When Tamara Pendell Crouch finally got around to telling her mother in Sedalia that she had, in fact, attended the festival.
My mother stood up and said, "What?" I said, "Yep, I went to all 3 days." If you could picture Carol Burnett and that face she used to make when she would get mad and she would fold her arms and squinch up her face, that was my mother.
Her mother wasn't alone. A lot of parents in Sedalia blamed the festival for corrupting their innocent children, turning them into drug addicts.
Everyone's mind was on one thing. They were unified with this tragedy.
In reality, Jefferson says Sedalia had to come to terms with some hard truths.
I mean, in a lot of ways, it's a quaint small town, but not nearly as innocent as it likes to think of itself, I think. Talking to the kids back then said, no. we were doing drugs like crazy and they weren't paying attention. The festival ruined our freedom because then they cracked down on it, so it really was the opposite. I had no idea.
How people remember and talk about that wild weekend and all its aftermath is still a huge part of Sedalia lore. Jefferson hopes to release his documentary about it all in the near future, but in the meantime, he'll keep gathering firsthand accounts from all the different people who were affected by that weekend 50 years ago. How do you think Sedalia was changed by the festival?
In a weird sort of way, it became part of the town's identity just because it was so intense and so much fear, whether it was based in reality or not. It affected everybody. Probably Sedalia never felt more like a community than it did then. It really became the favorite thing for people to talk about forever because normally Sedalia is quite boring.
A People's History of Kansas City was reported and produced this month by David McKeel, with editing by me, Suzanne Hogan, Mackenzie Martin, and CJ Janovy, mixed by David McKeel. Special thanks this episode to Lynette Brown-Giese and the Ozark Music Festival Facebook group, photographer David A. Mann, and filmmaker Jefferson Lujin. You heard clips from CBS Evening News, XERB Radio in Tijuana, Mexico, NBC, American Graffiti, and Jefferson Lujin's documentary, which is currently in production. The tentative title, The Story of the Ozark Music Festival, 3 Days of Sodom and Gomorrah in Sedalia, Missouri. Music from Blue Dot Sessions. You also heard bootleg recordings from the Ozark Music Festival, which you're actually hearing right now. Performances from Fresh Start, Bob Seger and the Silver Bullet Band, Souther Hillman Furay Band, The Eagles, and Nitty Gritty Dirt Band. Let us know what you thought of this episode by emailing us at peopleshistorykc@kcur.org. We also have a Facebook group you can join for more stories about Kansas City's past. And if you like this podcast, please consider writing us a review, rate it, and share it with your friends. And do stay tuned because we've got so many great stories coming up, including one about a Kansas Cityan that put a dance on the map like no other.
It was probably the first dance craze we had in this country.
Until then, I'm Suzanne Hogan. Take care and thanks for listening.